All right, so things in Minnesota are getting absolutely wild. And if you thought politics was just about policies and legislation, buckle up. Because what's happening right now with ILHAN Omar is showing just how fast a scandal can spiral into a full-blown narrative war. And the craziest part is most people have no idea how deep this goes. So first off, the background, new reporting suggests that Governor Tim Walz knew about massive fraud going on in Minnesota and allegedly did nothing to stop it. And the way people are describing it, the governor, his lieutenant governor, and even his chief of staff reportedly scolded whistleblowers who tried to raise alarms about what was going on, which, if true, is a huge deal because it turns a story about stolen government funds into a story about leadership, accountability, and the choices of people at the very top. Meanwhile, Congresswoman ILHAN Omar, representing Minnesota, has been caught in the middle of all this, and her statements to CNN that the fraud spiraled out of control because programs were rolled out without proper guardrails have been used to frame her as, in some people's eyes, partly responsible for the chaos. And it doesn't help that some of the people convicted in connection with this fraud are linked to the Somali community in her district, including, according to reports, the owner of the restaurant where she held her 2018 victory party, which has fueled speculation and criticism online about whether she was too cozy with people involved. And then there's this whole FOIA angle that Fox's Harris Faulkner brought up, talking about wanting to get the full list of over 300 arrests that Attorney General Keith Ellison claimed were connected to the fraud, and questions about the timing of those arrests. Did they coincide with when people were actually caught, or were they strategically announced after the story broke? The way journalists are digging into it, it looks like there's more to uncover, especially with hints that additional people may still be charged, which keeps the story alive and fluid. On top of all that, Governor Walz, when pressed by reporters about why the state hasn't been more aggressive in pursuing fraud at the state level, said they're working with the feds and that federal cases are coming. But he didn't directly answer why Minnesota itself hasn't stepped up, and critics online are framing that as a classic example of a left being allergic to accountability, treating oversight as judgmental instead of constructive, which explains why some commentators say you're hearing crickets from the governor right now. And then things took another turn when an old video of ILHAN Omar started going viral, showing her visibly upset because a Somali politician she was supporting, Omar Pate, wasn't doing well in his race. And in the clip, she's speaking Somali, but the English subtitles make it clear. She says things like, "We need to get rid of these people," which has triggered a firestorm online, with some commentators arguing that if Trump had said anything even remotely similar, the mainstream media would have been all over it for weeks. But because it's Omar, there's what they call a double standard. And this is fueling a narrative that her loyalty might be more to Somalia than to the United States, which some people find extremely controversial given her position as a US congresswoman. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because another clip emerged where she says, "We will never allow someone else to steal our land," which, again, is being dissected by critics who are asking, like, what land is she talking about, given that she's an elected official in the US? And then earlier this year, there was another post where she says, "Somalia is our home," which further inflames the discussion about whether her political and cultural priorities are aligned with her responsibilities in Congress. And she's not alone in that framing either, because there's also a Maine state representative, Dita, who was caught on camera saying, "Hopefully we will be able to help our country, our former country, Somalia," and people are picking apart even the language, the way she initially says "our country" while referring to Somalia, then corrects herself to former country, showing how even small slips can get magnified in this kind of media landscape. And commentators online, like Eric Darty, are taking it a step further, questioning whether people with these divided loyalties should even be allowed to hold office, which has sparked an intense debate about what it really means for elected officials to be fully committed to the country they serve, and whether cultural pride or diaspora ties should influence public perception of their performance. All of these elements are colliding at once, creating a perfect storm of media scrutiny, political debate, cultural tension, and public judgment. And the story is far from over. Because as more documents are requested, more clips surface, and more commentary flows online, the narrative continues to evolve, shaping opinions, alliances, and strategies for months to come. which is why paying attention not just to the facts, but to how the story is told is critical if you want to understand modern politics, media, power, um, and the ways that perception can be weaponized, manipulated, and leveraged. And that's exactly what's happening right now with Ilhan Omar, Governor Walz, and the massive fraud situation in Minnesota, a situation that started as a local scandal but has now exploded into a national conversation about accountability, identity, narrative, and power in a way that's captivating, messy, and impossible to ignore, making it a must-watch story for anyone trying to figure out not just what happened, but why it matters and how it's being used to shape politics, media, and public perception in real time. Then clips from Omar's past surface and go viral. Then political opponents and commentators start framing it as an identity and loyalty issue. Then legislators begin proposing or calling for policy changes, audits, and stricter oversight, which not only reshapes the story, but puts pressure on the governor and state officials to respond publicly, creating a dynamic where the narrative spreads faster than any court proceeding could. And it gives the perception of crisis even while legal processes are still unfolding. And that's exactly why commentators are saying this is political jujitsu, using public outrage, viral clips, and media framing to turn what might have been an administrative scandal into a sustained political lever, creating lasting effects on voter perceptions, community trust, and the political environment, because even if the actual legal consequences are limited, the perception of divided loyalty, mismanagement, and identity-based tension can have an outsized impact on elections, coalition building, and public opinion. And we've seen that play out before in other contexts where identity, trust, and representation intersect with legal or ethical controversies, meaning that Minnesota is now a kind of case study in how modern media, viral video, and narrative framing can transform the stakes of a local scandal into a national conversation about politics, culture, and power. And for viewers, this is more than just news. It's a lesson in how narratives are constructed, how timing and media amplification work, and how even small statements or clips can be weaponized to shape perception, influence voters, and reframe debates in ways that that actual facts of the case, like who committed fraud, how much money was involved, and what oversight failures occurred, might not fully reflect. And now the story is spreading. Every video, every post, every commentary adds layers, with people debating Omar's intentions, her priorities, her cultural identity, and the way that intersects with her responsibilities as a U.S. lawmaker. And as this conversation continues, it's becoming a broader discussion about what accountability really looks like, how elected officials balance multiple cultural and political ties, and how public perception can be shaped long before legal conclusions are reached. So, as you watch these developments unfold, it's clear that we're not just talking about a scandal in Minnesota anymore. We're talking about a high-stakes, multi-layered media battle where perception, identity, and narrative control matter as much, if not more, than the actual legal outcomes. And for anyone following politics, media, or power in the US, this is a front row seat to how stories evolve, how reputations are shaped, and how a single viral clip can cascade into months, if not years, of political and social impact. Which is why people are dissecting every detail, from the timing of arrests, to the specific wording of Omar's statements, to the media framing by outlets across the spectrum. Because in the modern information environment, every angle, every snippet, every viral moment can be leveraged to shift the conversation, change perceptions, and ultimately influence who holds power, who's trusted, and how communities respond. And that's why the Minnesota situation is now a national talking point, because it illustrates the intersection of fraud, identity, media strategy, and political consequence in a way that's messy, fast-moving, and highly instructive for anyone paying attention to how power works in the 21st century. And while all this is happening, the key takeaway for viewers is to watch not just the events themselves, but the pattern of narrative construction, how clips are surfaced, how identity is highlighted, how timing amplifies impact, and how multiple threads, legal, political, cultural, media, intertwine to create a larger story that affects perception, loyalty, and ultimately who wins in politics, whether in Minnesota or on the national stage, which means that even as you follow the legal proceedings, the public statements, and the viral clips, the real lesson is in seeing how these forces converge to shape the outcome before a single verdict is issued, and understanding that in today's world, political influence is as much about controlling the narrative as it is about controlling the law, the policy, or the vote. And as you think about that, consider this. Every time a clip goes viral, every time a statement is misinterpreted or reinterpreted, every time a journalist or commentator frames a quote in a particular way, they're participating in the same system that can either elevate or sink reputations, shift elections, and define how communities are perceived. And in the case of ILHAN Omar and Minnesota, and all of this is playing out against the backdrop of a massive welfare fraud scandal that is estimated to have involved billions of dollars in stolen or mismanaged funds through programs like Feeding Our Future, which was rolling out pandemic-era child nutrition funds with weak oversight, creating a perfect storm for abuse, mismanagement, and corruption. And to make matters even more complicated, the timing couldn't be more politically charged because these developments are hitting just as elections are approaching and national debates about immigration, welfare, and identity politics are heating up, meaning that what might have been a local fraud story has now morphed into a national conversation about loyalty, identity, oversight, and leadership. And the way the story is evolving, it's no longer just about whether crimes were committed or whether the people involved are guilty. It's about narrative control and who gets to define the scandal, who sets the terms, and who influences public perception. Because while federal prosecutors continue to pursue indictments and arrests, social media is simultaneously exploding with clips and commentary framing. Omar is someone whose priorities may not fully align with her constituents in Minnesota, which is forcing her and her allies to defend not just facts, but her identity, her loyalty, and her judgment. And that's a much more complicated game than simply proving wrongdoing in a court of law. And the media cascade is playing out in real time. First, the fraud is reported and arrests are announced.